The Cradle of Civilization, Ancient Mesopotamia. Introduction: The Cradle of Civilization. There is a term which is often used to describe certain parts of the world where advanced cultures first began to emerge, or which were particularly conducive towards societal development as the Neolithic or New Stone Age came to an end thousands of years ago. This, following the usage of the term by Victorian scholars in the 19th century, is the cradle of civilization. In these cradles, things like the first writing systems, the invention of the wheel, pottery, and mass agriculture are all said to have emerged roughly between 3500 BCE and 2500 BCE. Scholars speak of different cradles of civilization. One is Egypt, where the Old Kingdom quickly moved in the space of a few hundred years from developing the hieroglyphic writing system to building the Pyramids of Giza. Others are ancient China or the Indus Valley civilization of India and Pakistan. However, amongst all of these, one region alone stands out as the first and most clear-cut cradle of civilization. This is ancient Mesopotamia, the land approximating to what we call Iraq today. Between the middle of the 4th millennium BCE and the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, a period of 3,000 years, some of the most important early civilizations and empires the world has ever seen appeared and flourished here. Let's take a look at them in detail. The Geography of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia's emergence as a cradle of civilization is deeply connected to its geography. As anyone familiar with Iraq today will know, this is an extremely warm country, one marked by desert-like conditions in places, particularly in the north. Still, it formed part of the Fertile Crescent in prehistoric times, the crescent-shaped stretch of land running from Egypt northeastwards through the Levant and Turkey, and then southeastwards into Mesopotamia and Persia, that was left covered with layers of rich alluvial soil when the last glacial period came to an end around 10,000 BCE. This made the development of agriculture, urban life, and advanced societies much more possible here than in other parts of the world. Moreover, Mesopotamia is dominated by two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which run from the north of the country all the way south to pour into the Persian Gulf. Indeed, the word Mesopotamia means the land between rivers. It was on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates that the first great city-states of ancient times developed, and where so many things which we take for granted today, such as writing systems, the wheel, pottery, religion, and monumental buildings first emerged thousands of years ago. Finally, Mesopotamia dominates the passageways between the wider Middle East and Central Asia, and over time trade routes developed through the region that would augment its wealth and importance. Neolithic cultures of Mesopotamia. As with vast parts of the temperate zones of the Tropic of Cancer across Eurasia, a region stretching from Spain and France in the west all the way to China in the east, more complex Stone Age and Neolithic societies had been developing in Mesopotamia since the end of the last ice, around 10,000 BCE. In the Chalcolithic Age, the modern term for the Copper Age, a number of distinct cultures emerged along the course of the Tigris and Euphrates. In the north, around the modern-day convergence of Iran, Azerbaijan, and Iraq, the Hassuna culture was developing. Further south, covering much of northern and central Mesopotamia, was the Samara culture, while in the Mesopotamian lowlands, where the Tigris and Euphrates move closer to each other and eventually enter the Persian Gulf together, the Ubaid culture developed. These cultures were developing more sophisticated types of pottery manufacturing and tool making from around 6000 BCE onwards. Importantly, these people were not just fashioning pottery. They also begin to decorate it using pigments as paint and with elaborate geometric shapes. Agriculture also became more advanced here, both in terms of pastoral and agrarian farming, with more livestock domesticated and new irrigation methods developed to expand the amount of land under cultivation. All of these developments set the scene for the evolution of larger urban centers along the course of the two great rivers of Mesopotamia. The first Sumerian city-states. From around 4000 BCE, by which time Mesopotamia had firmly entered the Chalcolithic era, the first city-states were beginning to emerge along the course of the Tigris and Euphrates. Over the course of the 4th millennium BCE, over a dozen large cities would develop here, ones with populations in the tens of thousands, while many other towns with thousands of inhabitants also emerged. There was not a hegemonic centralized power that governed these cities. Instead, they were independent city-states that traded with one another. Occasionally, a ruler would emerge in one city that raised large armies and managed to establish control for a time over a large number of the neighboring cities. This was particularly the case with the city of Uruk, which eventually emerged for several centuries as the most powerful of the Mesopotamian city-states. So much so that scholars often refer to the 4th millennium BCE as the Uruk period in the history of the region. Other cities which had periods of ascendancy or were particularly populous were Nippur, Eridu, and Lagash. Many of these are synonymous with modern settlement points. Eridu, for example, is broadly coterminous with the city of Basra in Iraq today. Overall, this was a loose confederacy of city-states in the 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. We generally call this civilization Ancient Sumer and its people the Sumerians. This is derived from an Akkadian word for the inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia at this time, who, as well as living in close proximity to one another, began to develop a common culture based on their language, their worship of a common set of deities, and their technological breakthroughs, which necessarily impacted on how their lives were lived. Cuneiform. While the Sumerian city-states achieved many different things, they would deserve a position of some prominence in the early history of the world for one thing alone, if it was all they had achieved. It was here that the first writing system ever invented by humans was created. This was cuneiform, a word which transliterates as wedge-shaped, a reference not to the writing itself, but to the wedge-like stylus made from reeds that were used to carve out the cuneiform letters on the clay tablets that the Sumerians used to produce their early script. Cuneiform developed from around 3100 BCE onwards. Inevitably, for a technological breakthrough that was made over 5,000 years ago, we unfortunately know nothing about the individuals who might have been involved in first devising it, or why they did so. At the same time, archaeologists and historians of the ancient world have come up with a fairly clear theory of how it all happened. Cuneiform is a logosyllabic writing system, meaning that it does not use an alphabet of the kind which most modern writing systems are based on. Instead, it used pictograms or logos to represent words and concepts. These were then placed together in specific arrangements to form a system of written communication that evolved over time and gained currency amongst a wide range of people around Mesopotamia. The system was not devised to start writing books or plays. Instead, it was a practical development, one which allowed merchants traveling between cities and towns along the course of the Tigris and Euphrates to make records of how much wheat or wine they had sold in one city and how many bits of copper they had acquired from a merchant in another. In an age before monetary systems, when barter still prevailed, such a system was necessary to facilitate a growing trade network. Hence, Commerce begot the first writing systems, though the use of cuneiform soon expanded to facilitate government activity, the activities of the temples in the city-states, and then eventually the writing down of the first stories and myths. The wheel, pottery, and other innovations. It wasn't just the fact that cuneiform was developed in Sumer that gave it an edge over its neighbors in other parts of the Fertile Crescent. Hundreds of years before the devising of this writing system, roughly around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians were one of the first peoples in the world to invent the wheel. These were very basic to begin with. Tree trunks are generally circular, and people soon realized that if a hole was made in the middle of a log from a tree trunk and a piston of a kind like a pole was inserted through a hole in the middle of it, the contraption could then be used to roll heavy objects over distances without a person having to carry the full weight of it. These first wheels soon gave way to more sophisticated models. Indeed, part of the reason why trade was growing between the cities of Mesopotamia in such a way that necessitated a writing system like cuneiform to record long-distance trade was that the wheel had made commerce of this kind possible. Carrying pots by hand 100 kilometers in the heat of the Middle East is not practical. Rolling them on a cart is. Other inventions included refinements to the art of pottery, a trade which had developed millennia earlier, but which in the Sumerian city-states evolved to allow for more sophisticated pots to be fired in brick ovens. The first abacus for counting was also probably devised in the Sumerian city-states around 2700 BCE or sometime thereafter. Finally, local cults and religions were resulting in the construction of ever more elaborate temples in the cities of Mesopotamia by the early 3rd millennium BCE. By itself, this might not seem like a major breakthrough, but religion acted as something which lent cohesion to early societies and the flourishing of civic life, all necessary precursors towards further urban development. Early religions, with their concerns for reading the stars and omens, were also crucial in the emergence of astronomy and the early sciences. Sargon and the Akkadians. Sumerian civilization constituted a substantial development in the overall story of the history of humanity. Nevertheless, their power was decentralized, and they were not a major military or imperial force. It would take until around 2400 BCE before a Mesopotamian power began to emerge, which would build an empire that spanned all of Mesopotamia and adjacent lands. This was the Akkadian Empire, so named after the city of Akkad, from whence its rulers first emerged, which lies not far from where Baghdad is in modern Iraq. Between the 24th and 22nd centuries BCE, the Akkadians conquered all of Mesopotamia and expanded even further, still down the coastline of eastern Arabia and westwards into the Syrian desert, towards the Levant. The peak of their empire was reached under King Sargon of Akkad, a quasi-legendary figure who probably ruled sometime between 2350 BCE and 2250 BCE, though the chronology is unclear. He completed the conquest of the cities of Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, and numerous inscriptions have been found on walls and on clay tablets in the region attesting to his achievements. One such inscription refers to him ruling from the Upper Sea to the Lower Sea, the old Mesopotamian terms for the Mediterranean Sea and the Persian Gulf. Sargon was arguably the first emperor in recorded history in terms of building an imperial state in which he ruled over different groups of people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. The Epic of Gilgamesh. It was perhaps around this time that the famous story of the Mesopotamian king Gilgamesh first emerged. Unfortunately, we don't know the exact dates. The Epic of Gilgamesh is usually credited with being the oldest written story in human history. The first extant versions of it date to the 18th century BCE, and it evolved further down to the 10th century BCE. This aside, scholars agreed that a version of it was probably emerging in either oral or written form during the time of the Akkadians. The epic consists of 5 different tales involving Gilgamesh's struggles and journeys, often interacting with Mesopotamian gods and goddesses like Ishtar. Much of this is driven in the second half of the text by the death of his friend Enkidu, after the pair kill the Bull of Heaven. The epic is widely acknowledged as being a formative text in the history of civilization, not just because it is the earliest known written book, but also because key elements of it influenced other traditions in centuries to come. For instance, Gilgamesh's story features a great flood, which inundates much of the world early on in the story of humanity. The origin story would later find its way into the Hebrew Torah, and in turn from there into the Christian tradition of Noah and the Ark. And the Sumerian Renaissance. The Akkadian Empire represents the rise of a northern Mesopotamian power, which came to establish hegemony over southern Mesopotamia, where the Sumerian city-states had flourished between 4000 BCE and 2400 BCE. Soon, the process was reversed again. The Akkadian Empire declined from 2200 BCE onwards, whereas to the south, the Sumerian city-state of was enjoying a revitalization, which would see it begin to establish control over its neighbors. Over the course of the 22nd century BCE, the rulers of conquered all of Lower Mesopotamia and then expanded north into the lands of the Akkadians. They would rule here to the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, around which time new powers in the shape of Babylon and Assyria began to emerge from 2000 BCE onwards. There were distinctive elements to the rise of The economy of the city-states came under the tighter centralized control of the state, with the kings controlling agriculture and ensuring that a large amount of produce was siphoned off for the maintenance of the royal court and government and the temples. Meanwhile, state-managed building programs were becoming more effective. This is attested to by the Great Ziggurat of a huge stone brick complex standing over 30 meters high in the city. While ziggurats had been built by the Sumerians going back as far as 4000 BCE, this was of a standard of building which dwarfed earlier examples. These ziggurats might reasonably be compared with the pyramids of ancient Egypt in terms of the amount of labor and resources needed and the complexity of the finished edifices, though they are much less well known today. The Babylonians. Other city-states, such as those of the Amorites, had comparatively brief periods of ascendancy in Mesopotamia in the centuries that followed. The next great power, though, were the Babylonians. Beginning around 1900 BCE, the rulers of the city of Babylon, a settlement on the middle course of the river Euphrates, north of both ancient Uruk and Ur, began to emerge as a new powerful force in Mesopotamia. It would become the preeminent power in the region for the next 3 centuries. Still, its history is shadowy in places. There are, for instance, 2 separate extant Babylonian king lists, known as the Babylonian King List A and King List B, which provide different versions of the dynastic history of Babylon, and scholars still disagree on which is more accurate. What is clear is that Babylon reached the peak of its power in the 18th century BCE under rulers like Hammurabi, who extended their control over much of Mesopotamia. What is also clear is that Babylon's political power was far eclipsed by the breakthroughs it made culturally and intellectually, particularly in the spheres of science. The first scientists. The Babylonians have a claim to being the first scientists. This must be understood in light of the power of the priestly castes in Babylon. These held substantial power and were required by the Babylonian monarchs and ruling elites to provide information on a very wide array of issues, from how the harvest would fare that year to whether disease outbreaks might occur. Though their methods might seem crude to us today, these priests became the first scientists in a way in their efforts to acquire such information, or read omens that they believed were offered up by the movements of the stars or other phenomena in the natural world. For instance, because of their belief that the movement of the stars could reveal what might happen in Babylon today or tomorrow, these priests began observing the stars to a degree unprecedented prior to 1900 BCE. Their methods became extremely sophisticated. Studies have revealed Babylonian clay tablets which reveal that these priest scientists could predict the movement of the other planets in our solar system with very considerable accuracy. Moreover, because they did not have advanced telescopes or anything of that kind to conduct their observations, the Babylonians had to develop mathematical methods to track these movements. They used 60 as a base number to develop all kinds of equations, and over time predicted Pythagoras' theorem and other mathematical concepts more usually associated with the Greeks by over a millennium. The Babylonians effectively invented the fields of astronomy, arithmetic, and geometry. Hammurabi and his law code. It is also to the Babylonians that we owe the world's first great law code. This was produced during the long reign of Hammurabi, a Babylonian king who ruled from around 1790 BCE to 1750 BCE. Hammurabi was a warrior king. He waged war with many of his neighbors, notably the Assyrians, who, as we will see, were emerging as a great rival to the Babylonians in northern Mesopotamia. He was also one of the first rulers that we know of in recorded history to have been aware of the need for an impartial and fair legal system in order to engender the support of the people he ruled. The result was the Code of Hammurabi. We have an unusually large amount of evidence concerning this for the simple reason that a large basalt stele, a type of monumental rock onto which text was inscribed, was discovered by archaeologists at the city of Susa in 1901. This incredible object is surmounted by a carved relief depicting Hammurabi and the Babylonian sun god, Shamash, who moonlighted as the god of justice in their pantheon. Below this, there are then carved over 4,000 lines of cuneiform text which lay out the king's law code. There are a great many measures involved in this which we would recognize today. For instance, Hammurabi was the first lawgiver that we know of to enshrine the principle that people are innocent until proven guilty. It was strictly set out that individuals had a right to defend their homes from intruders, while those who accused others of serious crimes and were later found to have done so without evidence were to be punished themselves. Some measures concerning merchants, trade, and the provision of service involved an early version of the concept of insurance. If a builder, for example, constructed a house that was proved to be deficient in quality later, the builder was to be in charge of repairing or rebuilding it. Hammurabi's law code is a major statement about how developed the legal systems of Mesopotamia were becoming by the time of the Babylonians. The Assyrians. Babylon's heyday coincided to a significant extent with the rise in northern Mesopotamia of the Assyrian Empire, sometimes referred to as the Old Assyrian Empire, to distinguish it from an Assyrian power that came later on. This emerged from the city of Ashur in what is now northern Iraq, a power that filled the vacuum left by a declining Ur and Akkad at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. For hundreds of years, Assyria grew slowly as a power down to around 1600 BCE. Then, in the middle centuries of the 2nd millennium BCE, the High Bronze Age in the wider world of the Fertile Crescent, Assyria subjugated nearly all of its neighbors. Its emergence as an imperial power saw it become one of 3 entities that were in nearly perpetual conflict for control over the Levant. These were Assyria, the Hittite Empire based out of central Turkey, and New Kingdom Egypt. This was an era of unprecedented trade and prosperity in the ancient world. with goods from the southern Balkans being traded east to Mesopotamia and vice versa. With trade and political connections, there was also cultural osmosis occurring, and Assyrian expansion acted as the conduit, whereby many of the ideas that the Babylonians had developed between the 18th and 16th centuries BCE were transmitted to other cultures around the world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Though the process was slow, over time this cultural osmosis would impact on the development of Mediterranean society and the Greeks especially. The Late Bronze Age collapse. The Babylonians achieved great things, and their discoveries might well have continued to be passed on through newly emergent Mesopotamian powers like the Assyrians. Had it not been for the events of the mid-second millennium BCE. By around 1500 BCE, it was not simply Mesopotamia that was flourishing. Great powers had emerged across the Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, notably the Mycenaeans of Greece, the Minoans on the island of Crete, the New Kingdom in Egypt, and the Hittite Empire in Turkey. In fact, archaeological work in recent decades has begun to uncover new information about advanced cultures in places like northwestern Arabia that have previously been considered backwaters of ancient history. All of this, though, was about to experience a period of cataclysmic crisis and decline. This all began around 1300 BCE and would last down to 1150 BCE. During it, trade networks were impacted on by war between powers like the Egyptians and the Hittites. An enormous earthquake appears to have destroyed the Minoan civilization on Crete. Agricultural output declined, perhaps as a result of climatic shifts, leading to lowered food supplies and famine. Finally, to cap all of this, a mysterious group of invaders known as the Sea People began attacking these regions in large numbers, while the Dorians also began their ascent into Greece through the Balkans. All of this led to the collapse of most of the advanced Bronze Age civilizations of Mesopotamia and the wider region. This late Bronze Age collapse is now understood as having been as devastating to ancient society as the collapse of the Roman Empire later was to European society. Technological progress was reversed, cities were abandoned, and economic prosperity declined massively. Thus, Mesopotamia entered into a period of several hundred years of decline between around 1200 BCE and 900 BCE. The Neo-Assyrian Empire. The period between 1200 BCE and 900 BCE was one of the major transitions in the world of Eurasia, Mesopotamia included. Old powers like the Hittites had gone from the world, and others like Egypt had spiraled into considerable decline. It would never again reach the heights it had under rulers like Thutmose III during the Bronze Age. The crisis did present an opportunity for new powers to emerge, though. For instance, the Phoenicians and Canaanites, two mercantile trading powers with sophisticated cultures, flourished during this time in the Levant. Similarly, there was technological progress during this supposed Dark Age. People began to learn to utilize and mold iron into tools, realizing that it was better than the bronze they had been using for centuries. Therefore, out of the crisis, the Iron Age emerged. It was with this metallurgical breakthrough that a new Mesopotamian power emerged, one that aspired to world empire. These were a new Assyrian power, one which archaeologists and historians term the Neo-Assyrian or New Assyrian Empire to distinguish it from that which prevailed in Mesopotamia over half a millennium earlier. The Neo-Assyrians began to grow as a regional power shortly before 900 BCE. In the course of the 9th century BCE, they would conquer virtually all of Mesopotamia and then began launching campaigns into regions like the Levant, Persia, the Caucasus, and even as far west as Egypt. Ashurbanipal and his library. The Neo-Assyrian Empire would reach its height during the reign of King Ashurbanipal. He ascended as ruler of Assyria around 669 BCE and would hold the throne for the better part of 4 decades, down to his death in 631 BCE. He waged a series of immensely successful wars, notably against the Elamites, a powerful confederacy of people who ruled much of what is now southern Iran. His campaign westwards saw Assyrian rule over the Levant confirmed, though Egypt proved more difficult to establish sustained control over, emphasizing the limits of state power in the Iron Age. A campaign might be won in Egypt, but as soon as the Assyrian armies were withdrawn back to Mesopotamia, the local elites would revolt, confident that Ashurbanipal would need years to receive news of the revolt, respond, and march back to Egypt with an army. Beyond these territorial acquisitions, Ashurbanipal is well known today as the assembler of one of the great libraries of antiquity in the capital of his empire, the city of Nineveh. Beginning in 1849, a series of archaeological excavations here uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets containing books and texts written primarily in cuneiform. This vast collection, much of which is housed in the British Museum today, contains a very wide and eclectic range of works. Thousands of the tablets contain royal correspondence and other governmental documents. Others, though, are literary texts. There is, for instance, a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh amongst the tablets of Ashurbanipal's library. Others still are religious texts, calendars, and quasi-scientific writings, which purported to provide insights into farming and other activities through the interpretation of omens and the movements of the stars. Ashurbanipal's library was one of the great culminations of 3 millennia of ancient Mesopotamian civilization: Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Neo-Assyrian Empire's peak came under Ashurbanipal, and then it quickly collapsed. When the old king died in 631 BCE, there was a crisis of leadership amongst the Assyrians, and this soon led to the other city-states and powers of Mesopotamia beginning to reassert their independence. One such was Babylon, where a ruler by the name of Nabopolassar proclaimed himself to be king of Babylon in 626 BCE, independent of the Assyrians. Over the next decade and a half, he expanded his dominions, a process made possible by the collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. By the end of the 610s BCE, just 20 years after the passing of Ashurbanipal, the Neo-Assyrians had been almost entirely replaced as the dominant power of Mesopotamia by the Neo-Babylonians, a term used like that of Neo-Assyrian to distinguish this latter Iron Age Babylon from its more glorious Bronze Age predecessor over a millennium earlier. The Neo-Babylonian Empire would rise and fall quite quickly, lasting less than a century. It did have a heyday during that time, though, during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from around 605 BCE to 562 BCE. During his reign, he engaged in a series of extensive conquests which saw him reduce all of Mesopotamia to his rule, and then much of the Levant, Egypt, and lands further north towards modern-day Turkey and the Caucasus. One of these campaigns, against the kingdom of Judah in what is now Israel, famously led to the destruction of the Great Temple of Jerusalem, bringing the first temple period of Jewish history to an end, and initiating the infamous Babylonian captivity, through which large numbers of Jewish people were enslaved and brought to Babylon as prisoners of their conquerors. There they possibly helped cultivate the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the great system of tiered gardens in Babylon, which became acknowledged as one of the wonders of the ancient world. The rise of Persia. The end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and indeed of the wider political independence of Mesopotamia, was swift and sudden. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled down to 562 BCE. His lengthy rule might be controversial in Jewish history, but it otherwise saw the expansion of the Neo-Babylonian state and earned him the sobriquet Nebuchadnezzar the Great. Then, just 6 years later, after a rapid turnover of short-reigning kings, Nabonidus, a ruler of unclear origin, ascended to the throne in 556 BCE. After several years of decent enough rule, Nabonidus headed on a peculiar mission into Arabia. There, he began visiting esoteric religious sites and investigating them from the Tamar Oasis in western Arabia for roughly a decade between 552 BCE to 542 BCE, leading some historians to deem him to be the first recorded archaeologist. While he may have been an intelligent man, Nabonidus's long absence from Mesopotamia in the deserts of Arabia created the sense of a power vacuum at home. This was soon taken advantage of by Cyrus the Great, the ruler of the Achaemenid Persians, a group which had emerged in what we now call Iran to the east of Mesopotamia during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Cyrus began expanding their power in the absence of strong Babylonian leadership, and when Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon around 542 BCE, he found his empire being assailed on all fronts by the Persians. In 539 BCE, the Persians largely conquered Mesopotamia. Over the next several decades, Cyrus and his successors developed a Persian empire which stretched from Egypt and Anatolia in the west to Bactria around modern-day Afghanistan in the east. It would last for the next 2 centuries and brought independent Mesopotamian rule to an end after approximately 3 millennia of advanced societies, here going all the way back to ancient Sumer. The rise of Persia saw an eastward shift in the center of political power in the region from Mesopotamia to Persia. It was the end of an age to some extent as new ideas arrived from Persia that would transform the political culture and society of Mesopotamia. Still, the land of the 2 rivers would remain a center of political power in Eurasia down to modern times. The Persian Empire was conquered between 334 BC and 330 BC by Alexander the Great, following which a brief period of Greek and Macedonian rule came to an end with the emergence of a new Persian power, one which quickly conquered Mesopotamia too, the Parthian Empire, from 247 BC onwards. Over the next half a millennium, it would prove to be the only major centralized state that the Romans ever encountered, that they proved unable to militarily defeat and conquer. The Parthians largely operated from capitals in Mesopotamia, such as the city of Ctesiphon. After the Parthians came the Sassanid Persians. Then Baghdad emerged in Mesopotamia as the capital of the Islamic Arab Caliphate that ruled lands from Morocco in the west to Afghanistan in the east in medieval times. In the process, Baghdad became one of the great centers of learning in the medieval world. Thus, while Mesopotamia's history after the time of the Neo-Babylonians might have been characterized by domination by external powers from Persia and Arabia, the region remained the thriving heart of power on the crossroads between Europe and Asia and between the Middle East and Central Asia. There are few places in the world which so richly deserve the title of being the cradle of civilization. If you enjoyed our content, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any topics you want us to cover next, let us know in the comments. For now, we bid you adieu.